Before the night had screens, the night had silence, and Americans learned how to live inside it. In 1920s America, when the sun dipped below the horizon, life did not end, it transformed. Nighttime was not something to scroll through or escape into, it was something to experience. How Americans spent their evenings a century ago reveals a world that feels almost unreal today, slower, darker, more communal, and deeply human. The year 1920 sat at a strange crossroads. The First World War had just ended. The nation was healing, growing, and modernizing, but modern comfort was still unevenly distributed. Electricity existed, but it was far from universal. In rural America, kerosene lamps and oil lanterns still ruled the night. Even in cities, electric light was often dim, expensive, and limited to a few rooms. Darkness was not pushed away completely, it was negotiated with. When evening arrived, families didn't scatter into separate rooms, they gathered. Night was when the household reunited after long, physically demanding days. Kitchens became the heart of the home. A single light source, often a hanging bulb or a lamp on the table, pulled everyone into the same circle. Shadows danced on the walls, and conversations filled the spaces where technology did not. One of the most common nighttime activities was simply talking. Families talked about the day, about neighbors, about work, about worries they rarely voiced during daylight. Storytelling was not entertainment, it was tradition. Parents told stories they had heard from their own parents. Children memorized them without realizing it. These stories carried history, morality, humor, and warnings. In many homes, this was how culture survived. Reading was another cornerstone of the night, but reading in 1920 was different. Books were treasured, not abundant. A single novel might be read aloud to an entire family, one chapter per night. Newspapers were shared, passed hand to hand, discussed aloud. For many Americans, especially immigrants, nighttime reading was how they learned English, civics, and the rhythms of their new country. Radio was just beginning to enter American homes, but in 1920 it was still a novelty. Commercial radio broadcasting had barely begun. When families did have access to a radio set, it was often homemade or communal. Neighbors would gather in one house to listen together. The crackling sound, the fading signals, the mystery of voices traveling through the air. It felt magical. Even silence between broadcasts became part of the experience. Music filled many nights, not recorded music, but live music. Pianos were common in middle-class homes. Someone in the family usually knew how to play. Others sang along. In working-class neighborhoods, especially among African-American communities, evenings brought blues, jazz, and gospel, often played on porches or in shared courtyards. Music traveled without speakers, carried by open windows and warm summer air. Board games and card games were nightly rituals. Poker, checkers, dominoes, and parlor games kept hands busy and minds sharp. These games weren't distractions, they were social glue. Losing and winning happened face to face. Laughter was immediate. Arguments were settled quickly because everyone still had to share breakfast the next morning. In rural America, nighttime had its own rhythm entirely. After sunset chores were finished, farmers and their families gathered by the fire, whittling wood, mending clothes, shelling corn. Work didn't always stop at dark, but it slowed. The night allowed for reflection. Many people prayed together in the evening, something that has largely disappeared from modern routines. Faith was not scheduled, it was woven into the day. Teenagers experienced nights differently than adults. Without cars for most, and without phones for anyone, social life required planning and permission. Evening walks were common, so were front porch visits under watchful eyes. Courtship was slow, intentional, and public. Privacy was limited, but expectations were clear. Night held excitement, but also rules. Cities told another nighttime story. In urban centers like New York and Chicago, the 1920s were alive after dark. Theaters, vaudeville shows, dance halls, and early cinemas offered escape and glamour. Movie theaters were silent then, but the experience was anything but. Pianists played live music to match the scenes. Audiences reacted loudly, laughing, crying, shouting. Going to the movies was not passive, it was communal.
Prohibition shaped American nights in unexpected ways. While alcohol was illegal, it was far from absent. Speakeasies flourished in cities. Hidden doors, passwords, jazz bands, nightlife became secretive and thrilling. But even this underground culture relied on human connection, not algorithms. You had to know someone to be included. For working Americans, exhaustion defined many evenings. Factory workers, miners, dockhands, after 12-hour shifts, nights were quiet. A simple meal, a few words exchanged, then sleep. Beds were often shared. Privacy was rare. Yet even in these conditions, people valued the night as a brief pause from survival. Children's nights were especially different. There were no glowing screens to delay sleep. Darkness came early, and so did bedtime. But before sleep, children listened to adults talking, to wind through cracks in the walls, to the sounds of animals, trains, distant city noise. These sounds shaped imagination. Fear and wonder lived side by side. Night also carried danger. Without streetlights in many areas, darkness was real. Crime, accidents, and fear shaped behavior. People stayed close to home. Communities looked out for each other, not because it was idealistic, but because it was necessary. What stands out most about how Americans spent nights in 1920 is not what they did, but what they didn't have. No constant stimulation, no endless entertainment, no personalized feeds. Night was not consumed, it was endured, shared, and respected. Time moved differently then. A single evening could feel long. Silence was not uncomfortable, it was familiar. People learned to sit with their thoughts. They learned patience. They learned how to be present with others without needing distraction. Looking back, the nights of 1920 America feel both harsher and richer. Harder because life demanded more from the body and offered less comfort. Richer because connection was not optional, it was survival. When the lamps were blown out and the last voices faded, Americans of that era lay in the dark with nothing but their thoughts, their faith, and the promise of another demanding day. And somehow that was enough, because in a world without glowing screens, the night belonged not to technology, but to people.